the Women Making Democracy, and a great pleasure to welcome you to the panel on women, rights, and power. Your program will give you a biographical sketch of our distinguished panelists, but I will just mention here how lucky we are to have with us Dalia Mogahed from the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, Rima Khalaf, Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, Heba, Raouf, Ezzat from the Department of Political Science at Cairo University, and Snitow from the New School in New York, a co-founder of the network of East and West Women, who will draw some comparisons to transitions from Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. So we are absolutely delighted. I think Liz Cohen mentioned earlier the whoops of joy that we all had when we had the acceptances from our very first picks of who we wanted to come to speak with you today. We got complete acceptances, and we are very, very excited and delighted to have such a great group of panelists with us today. So I'm just going to start by saying very quickly that in the past, existing revolutions against existing governments have not usually made women's rights a central issue. And Munira Sharad mentioned in the first panel that in the first stage of many revolutions, women's rights are not at all central. Women combine with men to overthrow a tyrannical government, and only later are issues of women's rights raised. So that, for example, in the American Revolution, Abigail Adams famously wrote to her husband, John, who was meeting with his co-revolutionaries to write the Declaration of Independence and so forth. She wrote, in your new code of laws, remember the ladies, and do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation, echoing the very concepts that were going into the Declaration of Independence. And her husband replied, I cannot but laugh. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. And then, so too, in the French Revolution, Olympe de Gouges, journalist, penned the Declaration of the Rights of Women. How many people here have heard of Olympe de Gouges? Good, a fairly good number. This is quite a feminist group, but most of this audience has not heard of her, and that is generally the way things go in revolutions. But revolutionary change opens up hope, and women draw on those ideas, as, for example, in the US, the women in Seneca Falls in 1848 drew on the language of the Declaration of Independence and extended that vision of equality into the private sphere. But now, far more than in the American, French, and Russian revolutions, the current uprisings in the Middle East have brought women into the public eye as protesters. And in the blue bra girl incident that you saw in the first panel and also saw as one of the slides here, gender actually became the center of one significant part of the waves of protest. So we're in a new world now and have to rethink it with the help of our panelists. So to help us understand the role of women's rights and political power in the current setting in the Mideast, we turn first to Dalia Mogahed. But before we do that, I want to say that she has brought with her some very beautiful publications from Gallup about the survey research in the Middle East. If you very much want to have a hard copy, there are only 3 of each, and you're going to actively use it for your own work, please come and take a print copy. Otherwise, please look at these publications at www.gallup.com/Muslim Studies. Pretty easy, www.gallup.com/Muslim Studies, all one word. So you can access these publications. So thank you very much, Dalia. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by just exploring the idea of the Arab Spring, the role of women, and the idea of power dynamics. I want to start by saying that everything that I'll be talking about draws on survey research that Gallup has conducted in the Middle East among a representative sample of the population of each country of 15 years and above. Half our sample are women, half are men, and it spans the socioeconomic spectrum, as well as including both people who live in big cities and the countryside. So these are based on face-to-face interviews in the Middle East over the past several years. And I want to remind us of one thing that I think is sometimes overlooked. Bouazizi famously started the Arab Spring, of course, by setting himself on fire. But what preceded that was a police officer had demanded a bribe, or else wouldn't allow him to basically carry on with his livelihood of selling fruit at a fruit stand. And when he wouldn't produce one, took away his fruit stand. Well, the police officer, who was an agent of the state, of course, was a woman. Many people may not be aware of this, but the interesting power dynamic in that situation, which in fact sparked the Arab Spring, was actually a woman in power oppressing a man, in this case, his dignity and his economic rights. So when we think about the power dynamic and the role of gender, it's a very complex one, especially when there is this idea of what used to be something very powerful in both Tunisia and Egypt, which is state feminism. So what led up to the Arab Spring was not around gender inequality, as I think we all recognize. It was around economic, political, and social injustice in a broad sense. And women, our research shows, made up almost a third of protesters in Egypt. And they were as likely as men to support the protest that called for Mubarak's ouster. Now, after this initial stage of revolution, what now? What do men and women in these countries want, and what are the biggest challenges? I'm going to start with where there's common ground for cooperative rebuilding. First, men and women I'll just take Tunisia and Egypt sort of as case studies, share their democratic aspirations. Very high percentages of both men and women in both countries say that if they were to write a new constitution for a new country, they would want it to include fundamental rights of free speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. The other thing that men and women agree on in both of these countries is actually the role of religion in society. So what was so interesting about our research on what populations across the Middle East thought about the role of Sharia as a source of legislation was that there was no gender consensus. Instead, women in a particular country looked a lot more like men in that country than they did like other women across the border. So Egyptian and Tunisian women are a very interesting case study because they're so different from each other on the question of the role of religion in legislation, where Egyptian women are far more likely than Tunisian women to see a role looking much more like Egyptian men. And same with Tunisian women, very similar to their male counterparts. Now, even in Tunisia, where I think, as far as the Middle East is concerned, there's the least support for a very assertive role for religious principles in legislation. Even in Tunisia, the percentage of men and women who say that they see no role at all, or that Sharia should not be a source of legislation at all, is only 10%. Everywhere else, the remainder of the population thinks that, the majority thinks that Sharia should be a source, but not the only source That is the majority view in Tunisia. And the purely secular view is only 10% in Tunisia. In Egypt, it's virtually non-existent. That purely secular view is around 1%, and that is men and women alike. The other area of common ground is that majority of both men and women do support women's rights on a popular level. And that would include men and women having equal legal rights, equal rights to education, as well as employment. Now, here is where we actually do see the greatest gender difference. Now, there are majorities of both men and women agreeing that these things are rights women ought to have, but it is where the greatest difference between men and women exists in fact, even more in Tunisia than in Egypt, but both countries, we do see that gender difference. And here is where there is more of a gender consensus. Here is where women do start to look much more like their female counterparts across the border than their male co-citizens. And I think I'm just going to stop here and point out something I think is very important. I mentioned that women in Tunisia and Egypt think differently about the role of religion in society, but have very similar views about women's equality, and with very high percentages in both countries agreeing that these are basic rights that women ought to have. And that means that they have, especially in the case of Egypt, where they do believe Sharia should have a role, and in some cases a strong role, have negotiated within themselves a relationship where women's rights exist with Sharia. That this is an intellectual process that has already happened, where they're not seeing women's rights as the product of the exclusion of religion, but rather interpreting their faith to allow or to perhaps even encourage their own equality. And that will become very important in the future, because as these societies negotiate that relationship, women's role in that conversation is paramount, especially since they are part of that conversation as members of a society that look like the rest of that society. If they were to come at the issue of women's rights from a point of view that is so diametrically different from men in terms of coming at it from a very secular point of view, their point of view would be much more easily marginalized. But it's precisely because they're coming to that same point of believing in women's equality from the point of view of an indigenous point, or a view that looks like the majority of society in terms of the role of religion, that their view is much harder to dismiss. Now, do men's views of women's rights matter? And the answer is they do, and here's why. We found an empirical link between men's support for women's employment and the actual percentage of women who are employed in professional jobs in a country. Not just percentage of women employed, but employed in a professional job. The more men, basically the higher the percentage of men who believe women should work, the higher actual percentage of women who do work. Now, of course, the relationship can go both ways, but it does show that what men think of women's rights matters. Now, what is linked to men's views of women's rights? And this is, I think, the heart of the issue. Are men's views of the role of religion in society correlated to their views of women's rights? And the answer is no. There is no correlation between how men, their view of religion in society and the rights that they believe women ought to have. What is correlated is the percentage of male employment, as well as their score on the UN Human Development Index and their level of education. So just to sum up, what this suggests is that to improve or to increase men's progressive views, it's not necessarily around secularizing society, but rather broad human development.
Thank you very much. That's very exciting data.
Good afternoon. My name is Rima Khalaf. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. And I'd like to start by thanking Radcliffe for organizing this event and thanking you all for showing interest in women's issues and in Arab uprisings. In my comments, I would like to build on the discussion so far. I mean, this morning we have established that women have been at the forefront of all Arab uprisings. They have contributed to their success and to ultimately seeing 4 despots leaving on a plane or arrested by revolutionaries. But unfortunately, we have also seen that the initial euphoria about women's rights is giving way to a disquieting sense of frustration and disappointment. An increasing number of activists are currently linking the Arab transition to democracy with a regression in women's rights. This concern will be the focus of my comments today. I will try to explain why those people believe there has been a regression in women's rights, and then I would like to explain why I believe it is not fully justified. Finally, I would like to offer some insights into the road ahead. Let me start with the half-empty glass, the causes for concern. I think there are 4 intersecting factors that are causing some disappointment among women activists. The first is heightened expectations. As experiences from other countries have shown, democratic transitions offer tremendous opportunities for change, and therefore they bring with them a sense of empowerment and also immense optimism. But they also give the false impression that long-standing economic and social problems, including gender issues, can be resolved as soon as the despot boards that plane. But this rarely happens. And when they see that it didn't, disappointment sets in. This disappointment is even greater for women when they see that women's issues are relegated to second and third priority by the new ruling elite. In the immediate aftermath of uprisings, the new political parties tend to focus on positioning themselves in the new political arena, and also to focus on what they see as the big national issues, the new constitution, the new political structure, and they think that there isn't time to focus on secondary issues like women's empowerment. The second factor is the marginalization of women in some of the transitional political arrangements. This is particularly true in Libya and Egypt. This morning, Shahira mentioned that the some of the post-revolutionary governing bodies had very little women representation. The committee that was assigned to draft the new constitutional revision had no women whatsoever. In Libya, women were almost completely absent from the National Transitional Council. Just 1 woman was appointed to the council, but not to a ministerial portfolio. This was enough to trigger fears that women are once again being looked upon as unequal partners. The third factor is the rise of political Islam. There are fears that the rise of socially conservative political groups, particularly political Islam and Islamist parties, will result in a general decline in social freedoms and will also result in a regression in women's rights. What triggered this fear is that Islamists won a plurality in both the Tunisian and the Moroccan elections and an outright majority in the Egyptian elections. The last factor, the fourth factor, is threats to backtrack on certain pro-woman legislation. First, we have to say that despotic regimes have in the past used and abused women's issues. They used women's issues and gender empowerment in order to brandish their image and credentials as reformers and modernizers. They used it with their Western partners to tell them that they are the reformers. By focusing on the empowerment of women, Arab regimes succeeded actually in weathering the storm of Western pressure. For them, this was a win-win situation. It's, as opposed to real political reform, this was the only non-zero-sum game. They can give without losing anything. For them, they're not sharing power with their constituency. Actually, they are redistributing power among their subjects, so they had actually nothing to lose. They abused it by making the issue the pet project of the first ladies. Now, so they tended to control women's machineries, and they became the advocates of new legislation to empower women. And now this is firing back. And people who want to adopt populist points of view think that maybe by reversing some of what the former regime, former first ladies did, they can become more popular. And we've seen some statements that can be a cause for concern. Some of the remarks made by leading figures in Al-Noor party in Egypt on the possible cancellation of the divorce law, or what's called the khul' law, the law that allows women to divorce their husbands, and decreasing the age of marriage caused a wave of anger among women. Equally, in Libya, when Mustafa Abdel Jalil, the chairman of the Libyan National Transitional Council, was celebrating the liberation of Libya, he made an announcement that he would now allow polygamy. So the threats, of course, it didn't happen, but the threats and along with the other factors fostered some pessimism and some sort of a defeatist atmosphere. For women, the immense hopes of the first days of the uprisings had already started to fade. Now let me go to the causes for optimism, or the half-full glass. Actually, I would like to challenge this pessimistic hypothesis. And while I do acknowledge the short-term difficulties, I have no doubt that Arab uprisings will not leave women behind. I think that when we forge new social contracts based on the rights of citizenship, the right of citizenship will include women. But I will outline 3 reasons why we shouldn't be that pessimistic. First, the experience so far does not indicate a general reversal in women's gains. On the contrary, 2011 saw new breakthroughs for women. In a pioneering step, Tunisia and Morocco decided to lift all reservations on Snitow, making them the first Arab countries to do so. In Tunisia, the electoral law, which was mentioned this morning, was a first worldwide, the alternating men and women on party lists. Then women's participation actually did not shrink. In the recent parliamentary elections in Tunisia and Morocco in particular, they're a case in point. In Morocco, women captured 17% of parliamentary seats as opposed to 10%, almost double. In Tunisia, the percentage stayed the same, almost the same as at 27%. What is often pulled out as Exhibit 1 for opponents of this view is the case of Egypt. They point with apprehension to the significant drop in the percentage of women in parliament to a worrisome 1.8%. But I think we should remember that this is a result not of the uprising, but of a flawed electoral law decreed by an unelected military council. The law abolished quotas for women, and although it required each political party to name at least 1 woman on the lists, it did not demand or require that the woman is put in a winnable slot. Accordingly, we have this very low participation of women. Second, the rise of political Islam may be a challenge, but it does not justify a doomsday scenario. Actually, in the 2 countries where they have managed to form governments, Tunisia and Morocco, Islamist parties were true to their promise of protecting previous gains in women's rights. In their electoral campaigns, both had committed not to curtail social freedoms. They said, we're not going to ban alcohol, we're not going to require women to wear the hijab, and so far, they haven't. Furthermore, the recent decision by Al-Nahda party is very encouraging, where they decided that the Islam or the Sharia law is not going to be the source of legislation in the new constitution. To add to this, Islamist parties know the power of the masses now. They don't want to be on the wrong side of people. They also know that not all people elected them for the social agenda. Many elected them because of the way they perceived Islamist parties as neither corrupt nor corruptible. They saw Islamist parties as siding with just causes, and they're seen as independent of foreign interests and foreign influence. And they know this, and I think they will try to live up to their expectations. The third reason that I see for optimism is the dramatic transformation in the attitudes of women and women's movements. Women have grown more assertive. We've seen examples this morning, and they are mastering the courage to challenge unjust authority. Some referred this morning to the virginity test, but we have to remember that the virginity tests are not a new invention. Actually, they were invented by the geniuses of the former regime in order to intimidate women and prevent them from joining the opposition or opposing the regime. What is new, what we should see, how women responded to the abuse, how assertive they were. They didn't even hesitate to take on the military or the almighty military. And this is the new generation of women that we're seeing. Now, let me, despite this and despite these encouraging new dynamics, I believe that we still have, 1 minute, 2? Okay. We still have some historic challenges that continue to face women in the region. First, the first challenge includes legal discrimination and social patterns that shape positions of women in Arab societies. It's easy to change laws, but it's not easy to change customs, traditions, certain religious interpretations, and so on. It's going to take a long time. The second challenge is for women under occupation and in conflict settings. The region still suffers from the only remaining occupation in our post-colonial world, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. The daily plight of Palestinian women under Israeli occupation is immeasurable. They are denied their basic rights, security, freedom of expression and movement, a safe, healthy environment, and basic education. They live in uncertainty, fearing the demolition of their homes and the imprisonment of their children. Women under occupation still see little gain from Arab uprisings. The third challenge is women under conflict, but I think Nadia spoke about this, or post-conflict situations, about the situation in Iraq, where women seem to have gained the right to vote, but lost a more precious right, which is the right to life, as women are being targeted by violent groups, be it from organized military groups or the opposition. Anyway, to conclude, I would say that women still suffer from unequal treatment in law and practice, but I think there is hope that change in Arab countries will also change their situation. I also see that the road to democracy is going to be bumpy. We should expect short-term reversals, and we should expect counter-revolutionary forces to try in all Arab countries. And let me say, those counter-revolutionary forces are not only remnants of the old regime, but they include superpowers who have an interest in the region, and they don't want their interest to be affected, be it oil or probably in Syria, we're seeing it again. Also, we're seeing regional powers that have no interest in the expansion of democracy, and they will continue to fuel anti-revolutionary forces. Women, what should we do? I think our most important task now is to protect the revolution, protect it from sliding back into autocracy, or in some cases and in some countries into civil conflict. Only by concluding, reaching our ultimate conclusion of a democratic state can we protect the rights of women. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all, I think I should thank very much the organizers, especially Eugene heading this panel, and the Dean and the committee that organized the event. And I'm having the pleasure of being with Anne and Rima and Dalia on the panel. I want to introduce myself. I'm a political theorist, so there will be a bit of theory here, but I hope this is not too annoying, but I'll try all the time to draw on realities that I actually live as part of the revolution and part of the academia that is struggling to be also part of the revolution and combine both. So first of all, I would like to point to a methodological gap. I think that what is very clear that usually when we put the map of the revolution, each one of us tries to pick on a piece of the puzzle according to the background, to the discipline, to the approach, to the previous sort of study of the region or the specific case. But I think it's very essential to have such events to put the pieces of the puzzle together to be able to understand. Sociologists usually undermine the international relations issues. Political scientists undermine the sociological, anthropological dimensions. So you always feel that there is something missing in what we're doing. So the methodological gap that I'm referring to should actually go on sort of an attempt to try as much as we can to do interdisciplinary work when we take one of the topics. So for example, I would like to go along sort of putting the map of issues when we talk about women. So talk about the V's. So talking about the visual. So this is clear in media studies and mass comm and being interested in the Facebook and the Twitter and the visual arts, the graffitis. So the visual has been very powerful, and many people did not really understand what Egyptians or Tunisians or Yemenis or Bahrainis or Libyans were saying, but they could see. They could see the difference between the different countries by simply looking at the images, by simply following the news, because people look different in Yemen than they look in Libya, and you see the compassion of women, you know, it's like, thank you very much. And also they realize that women also look differently in different societies, though they are all belonging to an Islamic and Arab culture in the cases we mentioned. So the visual is very powerful and is very important. Nevertheless, we should not overstress in this case, the use of the media, and this is something I didn't have the time to say for the last panel, and I think that the issue of space is very important, but also we have to realize that the spaces that emerged in the social media are accessible to everybody. So I a bit disagree, or I have my own reservation regarding that the social media enabled the sort of modern and liberal and youth voices to come into existence and create and push for their own space, because there were also spaces for parents who jumped in to follow the accounts of their children and did not feel very happy about being blocked, and spaces for the Salafis also to enter into Twitter and engage in debates. And it was mentioned, for example, in the morning that Isra Abdel Fattah or Asma Mahfouz were voices that brought to the public sphere and also brought to the visual dimension new fresh voices. But you forgot another Isra, actually, who is the wife of one of the Egyptians imprisoned under, well, let's say, ambiguous charges in Saudi Arabia, who comes from a Salafi background and who has been trying to advocate the cause of her husband on Twitter. And here the Salafis have been supporting her very much on Twitter, yet this is the Saudi Arabia that you assume the Salafis sort of take as a model. And here they are condemning a human rights violation of an imprisoned Egyptian. So here things actually are very sort of, and I always like to play the role of the voice of a Salafi when there are no Salafis around, because I think that for long they have been sort of undermined, portrayed as fundamentalist, extremists, etc. And actually I know the threats, and I know that the discourse they have so far on women is quite very conservative, but I also know that conservatism sometimes is a matter of tradition rather than religiosity, and that sometimes people who engage in sectarian clashes in different societies in our Arab world are the less observant when it comes to the religious practices. You know, it's about when religion becomes, or a sect becomes an identity rather than a serious practice or commitment, etc. So things are a bit the vocal is very important, what slogans have been made and how women coined sort of their own slogans, especially in the case of Samira and the virginity test, etc. How you can see that these slogans and these words written on the signs when they were standing, opposing or protesting, that they made them themselves. And the vocal is very important here. The virtual is important because between the virtual and the real, women sort of moved smoothly. Whoever did not manage to be on the street, nevertheless helped on Twitter and Facebook to spread news, for example. It happened very frequently that somebody would be at home and people cannot have access to the internet, so they simply text and they say, put this on my, post it on my wall, or, so there has been a sort of an attempt to be between the two spaces and dimensions, the violent and the pacifist. The revolution has, at least in the case of Egypt, has not been, as it's assumed, less violent than any other places. The problem is that violence has been sporadic and has been sort of underestimated. So we had, in the case of Mohammed Mahmoud clashes near to the Ministry of Interior, we had over something like 6 to 8 weeks, 47 plus dead, and far more casualties. But because they are not like the Libyan case, they are not like the Yemeni case where you see the rifles and the RPG clearly in the picture, people think that it is less violent. But violence has been very systematic on behalf of SCAF, of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, and people have been struggling to keep what is going on the street pacifist, and women have been really serious part of that. I remember very much that one day in the morning, in end November, early December, when we had the clashes of Mohammed Mahmoud, that and the cabinet clashes as well, that there was a shooting from 3 to 5 a.m. and then I went to the square to explore the situation, and we found out that there are so many people who are injured, youth who are injured in Omar Makram Mosque, and there was no ambulance coming into the square as usual. So we went near the museum, grabbed a driver and said to him, and he said, I will not pass through the square, I will go from the other side. Anyway, he came eventually, and there was an attempt to close the square. And there was this young man who said, we have to close the square, bastards, they killed our friends, and look at what they did, etc. And there was blood all over the street and the square area. And I said to him, is it better to close it? Or is it better to leave it open and to show everybody who's passing by in cars and buses and walking that there is the blood because they keep saying we are thugs, and to stand next to it and explain who died and why and how? And it actually turned into an exhibition. Everybody passing by saying, what are you doing on the square? Enough is enough. We want to have peace and stability. And then when they look and say, really, blood? And we started explaining that there was like shooting from 3 to 5 a.m. and then they started at directing their anger to SCAF and directing their anger actually to those who actually used the bullet, not to those who used the stones. So here you have this sort of violent pacifist relation, and even you find, if you follow on Twitter and Facebook, that many young people would say no silmiya anymore, it's not peaceful anymore, they are killing us, we will not resort to peace. And usually you find the voices that are saying no, we want to keep it peaceful, are voices of young women or voices of old mothers, not old, mothers on Twitter or on Facebook saying that stick to being peaceful, don't let them drive you to violence, etc. So it's interesting to see the element of the participation of women on all levels. There is also the virtuous. When people try to come to terms with what are the civic virtues that we want to defend, I think that women have been trying to participate in defining that, whether it is by drawing the lines along secular, liberal concepts, or by putting forward an understanding of Islam that might be a bit Salafi, sometimes a bit more moderate sometimes, but women have been engaged in that as well. Okay. The last word is the vernacular, not my last word, but the last word in this sentence, you know, the vernacular. This V of the vernacular is also very important because we have been focusing very much on measures and scenes that take place in the heart of the city. But we have not been seeing what's going on in Suez, what's going on in Sinai, what's going on in Bedouin areas. And here we have, next to the methodological divide or gap between different disciplines to catch and to understand the different variables in action and how they relate to each other, the divide between the Bedouin, the rural, and the urban. And we discovered in Egypt, for example, that we have Bedouin areas. And we discovered that in Upper Egypt we have tribes. Though they are residing, they are not the tribes of Libya, they are not nomads, you know, but we have tribal relations and we have kinship relations and strong families in the Western Sahara of Egypt, in Sinai, in southern Egypt, in the northern coast. So this element also came to the scene. Cities are not only the cities a la the city-state, because when we defined in history of political thought the city and citizenship, we have been, our mind has been captured by this image, while actually Nizar al-Sayyad, the professor of urban studies at Berkeley and who is heading the Middle East Center, reminds us when he talks about medieval citizenship. He's talking about the enclaves in the city. He's talking about medieval relations and ties and feudal ties that are residing in the areas around the city and that are inhabited by more citizens than the citizens inhabiting the heart of the city itself. So here different notions of citizenship come to be presented and represented, and here we also have some sort of an ambiguity that we have to struggle with. I mean, there is also the demographic gap, the gap between different generations that is very clear. It's usually confrontational when it comes to a Salafi talking to an anarchist on the internet, but eventually it ends with a joke, you know, or it ends with a block after bad words, but somebody jumps in and say, because you know that Twitter, you can just join even if he blocks the guy, you can jump and say something and comment, and it's posted to both. So this gap is real, and many people see what is going on as crisis on the political level in Egypt as actually a gap between generations, including the Muslim Brothers and the SCAF, even if they have their own issues between each other. But it's the old mentality and the old way of thinking that did not accept whether by the SCAF nor by the machine of representative democracy to include a younger generation, men or women. So there is a demographic and a generational gap. There is also a conceptual gap, and this is my last point, between democracy and the republic. Democracy is fine, but if you are not framing it along the lines of republic, the presence of people in the public, the nature of the public and how they reach some sort of a minimum understanding of the public philosophy that they agree upon, democracy will be just a tool to reproduce authoritarianism. And I think that where you want to see women in action now in Egypt, it is in the domain of the republic and whatever is public. They are very much present, they have been very much empowered, while the democratic process itself is still under the calculations of the big elephants of the old regime. Still, we are dealing with the SCAF, with the Muslim Brothers, with the Wafd Party, with the old elite that is running the show, basically, interfering sometimes, withdrawing sometimes. And for those who are following the whole debate about the Constitutional Committee in Cairo, in Egypt at the moment, who realize that it's actually, we are absent. I mean, the younger generations are absent, women are absent from that debate because it's between the democratic and the republic notion. Yeah, women are very much into the republic, into reforming the public sphere, but the democratic machine was not really reformed enough. My last word is, I'm very keen to challenge the notion of state feminism. I think it's too mild for my taste. State feminism means that, okay, the state is actually, according to our understanding, the vehicle of politics in our modern times. State feminism does not really sound very progressive, but anyway, I mean, state feminism is better than nothing, you know. No, I would really call it feminization of authoritarianism. And this is the other side of the coin of feminization of poverty. equality, because there are some women there suffering from the system of capitalism that is restructuring the gender relation, and here we bring in the economic factor, and the other side is that there are women who are benefiting from there and who do not want to see their interests belonging to specific classes and specific circles challenged, and this is what we have to remember when we see the scene now of different feminist voices and voices calling for women's rights in Egypt. There are voices that are not on the media, that are not in the political sphere, but they are actually voices that are in the republic domain, that are trying to strive for more spaces and to be their concerns to be voiced. It's a bit complicated to look at that very complex map, but I don't think that we have any other choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I add my thanks to all the other speakers. This is very thrilling to be together like this. In her letter to us, Jenny Mansbridge described the astounding changes we are gathered here to discuss as full of promise and full of peril. That's exactly how I and many others saw the revolutions for which the fall of the Berlin Wall can serve as a figure. Just like Arab Spring, everyone was astonished at the collapse of Soviet hegemony. No one expected such popular passion or the end of a communist control that had lasted over 40 years. Of course, with hindsight, we can see beginnings way before, years of frustration and clandestine resistance, but no one expected these hungry factory workers or disaffected intellectuals to join together and, after years of tunneling underground, finally break the surface and bring down regime after regime. So it was a moment of liberation. But something strange happened on the way to liberation. I can only give a short list here. The economy changed overnight, and women became disproportionately unemployed. We may get an opportunity to talk about the neoliberal aspects of all of these revolutions. I think we should. In Poland, the first law of the new parliament was to ban abortion, a right Polish women had had since 1956. Suddenly, elections were free, and women disappeared from politics in country after country. A famous example is Romania, that had a quota in the meaningless parliaments from before of something like 40%, and it went down to 4% in one election. There were religious revivals which redefined womanhood and women's rightful place as hearth and home. Social services, such as they had been, and of course they were not what people were satisfied with, but such as they had been, they collapsed immediately. A particularly dramatic example would be what happened in Osh, Kyrgyzstan. The number of daycare centers went from 76 to 13 in merely months. And this is a short list. And there was no visible resistance to these changes. They were heralded, in fact, as a return to the normal. In this construction, patriarchy was the heart and soul of anti-communism. You could see how that flip happened. A return to a decent, free life. I suspect a similar dynamic haunts Arab Spring. Traditional patriarchy is seen as a bulwark against Western influence, and we've heard a lot about that. When I first started as a teacher and activist in East Central Europe 20 years ago, I began to keep a list of reasons why feminist thought there was so unspeakable and feminist action so unthinkable. I don't have time to rehearse this list here, but if you're interested, we can explore the reasons why, in a number of the revolutionary clusters we're talking about today, feminism can often be rendered homeless, with an invisibility and inconsequence that in each case is overdetermined. In other words, many different elements combine to make feminism unspeakable. And that's something we might want to discuss, the ways in which something like that is worked from many locations. Suffice it to say here that in the euphoria of 1989, the shared ecstasy of long-desired change, anyone who spoke of gender difference would have seemed grotesque, perverse, even vulgar. As Elżbieta Matynia said to me at lunch today, ridiculous. That was a word I left out, but it's right. You seemed ridiculous if you brought up gender in those early days. Are we not all brothers and sisters here in the square, in Gdansk, in Cairo? Suffering under the regime was willy-nilly shared by almost all. So surely, too, liberation is shared. To say change was gendered, to claim separate grievances, would be to break solidarity and to forget men's and women's continuing need of each other for survival. Again, I think it's interesting to compare this with the Arab Spring descriptions we've been hearing, the aggressive, violent sexism that has happened a lot in Arab Spring, I think may actually give birth to feminism as a popular reaction. That was not particularly possible in East Central Europe. It was a much more quiet, I mean, being ridiculous is harder to fight than being hit in the head. To interrupt this triumphal, usually neoliberal, proudly masculinist parade has been a piece of work for the feminist movements that have in fact developed all over the region. I'll just suggest some of the lessons, it seems to me, that activists have learned in this often maligned effort to bring the multiple oppressions and second-class citizenship of women into visibility in East Central Europe. So again, a list. 1. We've developed acute skepticism about the concept tradition, and this has come up again and again. Just which part of the past are these neo-traditionalists choosing? Traditions can be called into being overnight, and they can also be quickly abandoned when expedient. And of course, they can be invented, as several people pointed out. This brings me to point number 2. Women are often figured as anchors who hold the traditions of a people together. They are culture, a thing antecedent to politics. Many activists have come to be suspicious of this depoliticization of women's position, which Shireen described, I thought, very richly this morning. It's useful to a largely male political culture to remove women's grievances, oppression, struggles from the realm of political power relations. But men have culture too, and feminism inaugurates a political effort to change not only laws, but the cultural assumptions that shape these laws. When women are a collective, women in the lump, and men are individuals, there's a double distortion. On the one hand, male power isn't recognized as a deeply embedded cultural phenomenon and system. And on the other, women's right to participation as individuals is occluded. So it has a double whammy. I, these days, have been very active in Occupy Wall Street. And I have to say, one of the really hard things that comes up for a feminist is the effort to cordon feminism off as a side issue. Everyone says, no, we're worrying about the economy. And then when you say, gee, feminists worry about the economy, you're sort of asked to form a feminist bloc about that. Much as I understand the separatism of earlier days and needed it as others did, this is not the moment for that, because actually we want these questions to be part of the entire Occupy project. And it's very interesting to see how it gets relegated to culture in a very irritating way, I think I could say. 3. Many activists struggle with the need for a double vision when we speak of difference. And a discussion of difference is how I'm going to conclude this. I'm going to try to problematize difference in a number of ways. In the effort to establish feminism in largely hostile territory, the concept difference is labile and ambiguous, and can be both useful and pernicious in turn. Take, for example, the wisdom we've reached about how different we all are in this room. Recognition of difference among women, and men too, is one of the signal accomplishments of modern feminism. The lump, women, has been deconstructed. a liberating move. But difference can also become a fetish, obscuring the fact that there are strong cross-cultural similarities in our situations, and an urgent need for mutual recognition and solidarity. For example, in a recent film about worldwide violence against women, the initial statement that such violence is everywhere was defeated by the imagery, which was almost entirely of colorfully draped and often veiled women in the South and East. I've heard American women say that we don't really need active feminism in the US anymore, but those poor women in Muslim countries. We must not let the shibboleth of difference pull us apart like this. The othering of Muslim women obscures the way in which Western women have heavily gendered fates and, of course, suffer violence. So, difference needs constant analysis. It can be politicized in many different ways. To carry on with this crux or not, the question of difference, here's point number 4. Feminists all over the world share many values, ideas, and dreams. But at the level of strategy, in Joan Scott's wonderful phrase, feminism has only paradoxes to offer. To be locally resonant, vital, democratic, and responsive and creative, feminism must have many faces. Feminists are constantly having to reposition themselves. Since feminism doesn't stand alone, it is a key strand in liberation movements, or should be, but the struggle for justice for women requires an endless rethinking of entry points, acceptable and unacceptable alliances. This is where those questions in the morning about, is there a left feminism? Yes, one of the questions in Poland was that was unthinkable when I first started to work there, and now it exists. And these are different affiliations that different women are choosing. Feminism is always with some kind of larger, oh my gosh, 1 minute left. Okay, skipping right along. The question we kept asking ourselves in the early days after 1989 was, what is the political? What do we demand, and when and where? On one day, we must ask to be protected, and on the next, we must critique women's position as the ones who need the protection of men. On one day, we choose to be uncompromising, for example, in the struggle for abortion in Poland, but on another day, Polish women decide that this demand is divisive and is killing feminism. These feminists abandon the fraught abortion issue and en masse at a big conference decide to demand parity in Parliament instead, and they win. Feminism's first major victory, a parity law. Of course, it is hard to enforce and make meaningful, but this new visibility of women is startling nonetheless. Now there are to be 35% women in the Polish parliament. And just as Shireen described this morning, many radicals point out how empty and depoliticizing this is. After all, having a woman in parliament may not have anything to do with feminism. But the parity organizers themselves were hopeful that this breakthrough, however nominal, might bring others, which brings me to one more point on this list, which could obviously go on and on, number 5. Again, the angst and promise of difference. With a growing feminist movement comes fragmentation. This especially to give comfort to people who suffer from the falling apart of movements that we've known. With a growing feminist movement comes fragmentation, fundamental disagreement, often bitter breakups. Dear sisters, let us not repine. Feminism is not a unified ideology. Feminists seek many different affiliations, and feminists choose very different strategies. For example, women's movement strength often lies in insider-outsider strategies. Some work with the government, while others demonstrate loudly outside. These differences are political, strategic, and often aesthetic. A vital, proliferating, visible feminist presence is rarely a unified presence, but the enraged outsiders move the center, help the insiders win. Fights against oppression don't bring an essentialized unity. We women are not are not won in any essential way. But sometimes we can find political common cause and shift the culture of gender through our work, now linking us all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting comparison. I want to ask the participants first to ask questions, and including the panelists to ask questions of one another. I have two questions. One is how you all think about the importance of quotas. Anne pointed out that when Poland lost its quota system, it more or less immediately lost all its women in parliament. We do know that there are many different kinds of quotas, and it seems as if the kind that we have in Tunisia, which has been mentioned several times, in which the parties are required to have quotas and in which they're required to put men and women in alternating positions, not the woman at the bottom, so that the woman never gets elected. That seems to be one of the most effective forms of quotas. So I want to ask you all about quotas. And a second, just from Heba's remarks, whether you think nonviolent revolution particularly advantages women. It seems to me that it does, that we've seen in the protests in the streets in nonviolent revolution, where the theme is peacefully, peacefully, that seems to bring out a lot of women. When you get a revolution more like Libya's, that seems to advantage men. So I want to, those are two questions I would like to ask. Let's put them on the table for a moment, get some questions from other participants. Is the mic around somewhere? Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you all very much. Dalia, I think that we often get very surprised when you see the difference between our commonsensical perceptions and empirical realities on the ground. And I think the survey, like the one that you were involved with, really shows that. But I have one question. I mean, you ended up arguing that in order to increase sort of men's progressive attitudes rather than pushing for a secular agenda, we should push more for human development. I mean, that's, okay. So now I would like you to then explain Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, where, I mean, we cannot speak about unemployment of men, but certainly in terms of attitudes, as far as I know, they're quite conservative in terms of gender ideologies. So if you could elaborate on that. And Heba, just want to say I very much appreciate your comment on state feminism, and I think I, for myself, will rethink that when I talk about it. But I have a question, and I hope I don't want to put you on the spot, and I don't want it to get too personal, but I'm really very curious to know what, for you, what is your political project right now? I mean, I know that it's all what we do is intersectional, and we have lots of different. I mean, I always associated you in the past with a project that was democracy, human rights, maybe a form of Islamic feminism. Where do you position yourself, and who is the collectivity that you would like to associate with right now? What's your project? And I guess maybe linked to that, and linking back to Dalia's survey, Islamic law, I mean, what role should Sharia play in the future Egyptian constitution in your view?
Suppose we go to Dalia first, and then we'll ask Heba to respond.
Thank you. I think the main takeaway for me from the research is that we have to look beyond simply how men view the role of Sharia to explain their progressive or non-progressive views of women. So in the case of specifically that research, we actually found no correlation. What that means is there's another factor that's at work. And we didn't test, there's no correlation between how men view the role of Sharia and how they view women's equality. So what that means is they could have very high support for Sharia and very high support for women's rights, or very low support for women's rights. There's just no connection. So in the case, so the two examples you cited, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are two places where, I mean, first of all, they're very different. I've lived in the UAE for the past year and a half, and anyone who's been to Dubai knows that it's it's closer to Las Vegas than to Riyadh, but bears no resemblance. So there's a huge difference. But where there are regressive cultural practices around women, what our research suggests is that there are complex other factors that we have to look beyond simply secularizing society. There are cultural issues, tribal issues. There are dynamics of power. There are governmental relationships between the ruling class and a powerful religious interpretation that need to be balanced. So I don't see them as sort of counter evidence to what I was saying. It just shows that there is in fact no correlation. You can have a place where it's, the idea is that Sharia is strong and women's rights are nowhere to be seen, but there's also places where the support for Sharia is much higher and support for women's rights is also very high. So it just goes back to there's a third factor, a fourth factor, and a fifth factor that is explaining those differences, and our empirical research shows it's not Sharia.
Thank you.
Okay, regarding the quota, I refer to this Romanian case. It's like it was basically artificial. That if you take the indicators and the figures, then wow, we had more women in the parliament, but whom did they represent? So if we are honest enough, if we are fair enough, if women are not really into politics, if they are not advocating their own cause, then what you do is what you get. Okay, so does this mean that the state should not intervene to support? Definitely, but I think that the quota has all the time in the Egyptian case been seen as an imposition. And there has been serious problem trying to fill the quota seats with women, and usually they came from the circle of friends, from the elite around Suzanne Mubarak, to say the truth, So what you see is now what you get. You have, I think, 4 from the Muslim Brothers. You have none from the Salafis, which is the reality of the Salafi circles. They put some women on the list, but at the very bottom. You have a couple of Christian women. And you have a woman that has been, I think, elected on the liberal lists. So this is what you get. It's not as aspired, but we hope that in the course of time, it would really develop naturally. So if you think that, or if a system decides that it wants a quota, I don't think that quota should be left as a bulk of quota for women. There should be some sort of criteria, who is representing women from which different backgrounds, which ages, because I have not seen in the quotas of the Arab world a young woman, for example. While I met in Tunisia, actually, an MP who has been elected on the Nahda list who is 26. I was really surprised, it's like I was really proud as well. So this is something genuine, it's true, it's real, because they are really empowered within the Nahda. So if women want to have more say, they should work harder on that. Nonviolence gives advantages to women, and women should actually defend nonviolence simply because it gives them a secure space. I mean, it's very unlikely that in clashes, when there is an exchange of fire, gunshots, etc., women would be going on the street. I'm a mother, I have 2 girls and a boy, and I wouldn't like to see my girls on the street. They have been on the street actually in the Muhammad Mahmoud clashes at the very back without taking my permission. But anyway, I found out that I am quite outdated about what's going on in my household. But eventually, I felt like I have to be sincere and really have the integrity not to prevent them from going on the street. But at the same time, it was really risky. So I trusted that they have the wisdom not to be in the forefront. And usually in the forefront in clashes, you will find men, not women. In the revolution, women were there, by the way. In the forefront on the camel battle. There were women in the forefront. And but at the end of the day, the more it's pacifist, the more it's peaceful, the more it's nonviolent, the more families encourage their women to go. And families go. I remember that even when the square was closed in November, I saw with my own eyes, though, people knew that clashes take place during the night. When the square is was almost empty, except for those who stay there. So I saw families going and putting on the gas masks. The kids and the mother and the father going into the square, all with with the masks. You know, it looked really very fun. But they felt that this is fairly safe.
I think we should perhaps ask for another question from the participants. We'll ask for 2 more questions for the participants. How much time do we have, and then go to the audience? Do we have time for 2 more from the participants, and then? So let's have 2 more from the participants, and then we'll ask questions, get questions from the audience. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, I didn't see.
Oh, about quotas.
About Heba's political project.
Oh, to Heba.
Okay. Answer the personal question.
Let's put it at the back of the session. You know, I will elaborate later. Give a chance to people to ask.
Malik Azral, I have a question for Heba also relating to the question you asked earlier in the previous panel about you were starting to talk about niqab, which has come back in Tunisia, or appeared, I would say, in Tunisia, and you were you almost started to talk about it, but there wasn't enough time, and so I wanted to ask you to elaborate on it.
And perhaps you could take a moment just to answer very briefly the personal question.
Should I do that now? Yeah, regarding the niqab, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's invented. I mean, at the end of the day, it was not very common at all. Nobody saw it before in Tunisia, as it's mentioned. But eventually, if you have such an extreme secularization that not allow people into mosques except with their ID, and when they did, they were arrested as well. And when you had feminists who were supporting Ben Ali while the Nahda women were actually imprisoned, and more narratives are coming back and coming out now regarding what happened actually to the Nahda women and the silence that they suffered from, and the sort of neglect of their own cause and what they were subject to. I think that you expect, when there is freedom, that some people will pick on the niqab as a sort of the pure form of religiosity or whatever. This is understandable. I mean, the Arab world is one entity eventually, and this is one of the things that people might opt for. But I think that there is also a dimension of a support. This is my reading of the map of politics in the region, because I have no reason to sort of explain why 3 times Naif bin Abdelaziz has been to Algeria. I mean, this is not Monte Carlo, you know. It's like it's not a resort. It's not a. I mean, it's an interesting place to go. But the Saudi-Algerian link. I mean, what are they doing in Algeria? And Ben Ali, we have to remember, did not go to Mozambique. You know, Ben Ali went to Saudi Arabia. So there is something here about supporting some sort of radicalism that has its own roots in the society. I don't say it's completely invented, but I would see that there is no interest for the Algerian system and for the Saudi system to have a successful model of moderate Islam in Tunisia. And I think that the attack on Sheikh Ghannouchi regarding what he's mentioning regarding being gradual in applying Sharia, etc., the man already paid his life for what he believes in to be Islam, so nobody actually can accuse him of being secular or whatever. But he sees the map and he can understand the challenge that Tunisia is facing. But here comes this sort of dimension of radical Salafism becoming more and more visible to sort of frighten those who are on the other side. And I think that some factors are innate, but some factors are also regional.
Briefly, I'm listening to the panel, and I appreciate all the papers. I'm wondering whether it would make sense to unpack the concept of women's rights that we are using as a kind of general theme. I think that in each culture, there are some women's rights that are more acceptable to the majority of the population, and others that are less so. I often tell my students that issues having to do with family law, with personal status in the Arab Muslim world is kind of similar to issues of abortion in the United States. Those reproductive rights. The question of employment, participation in the political system, increase in educational rates do not appear to me to have the same weight and the same political/cultural power as questions of family law and personal status. So my question is to Dalia and Rima. When you're talking about women's rights in the region and attitudes, which is what you were telling us about, and backlash, etc., do you see a difference between those attitudes about different kinds of women's rights? In the same way, I'm suggesting that maybe, and this is for Heba, that the whole question of state feminism needs to be deconstructed and unpacked, because we've had people like Ben Ali and Mubarak really using and abusing, and then we also had a form of state feminism in earlier historical periods like Atatürk and Bourguiba, where it was maybe not genuinely for women, but it was a different political project from the Ben Ali and Mubarak. So I think all those concepts that we use, women's rights and state feminism, in fact contain a lot within themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Rima, Dalia.
Maybe you want to take all questions and then we
You
respond.
want to take some more questions from the audience? And I think, is this time to take questions from the audience, do you think?
Okay.
Perhaps we'll collect a couple of questions from the participants and then collect some from the audience. So if you all will take notes when you, and then we'll just ask you to respond as we go through. So two more from the participants and then we'll collect from the audience. Yes.
Thank you. I have two small comments. First to Dalia, when you are telling about a survey, 10% only of Tunisians are agree with the principle that Sharia would not be included in the constitution as a principal source of the legislation. How then to explain the late position of another party when it decided to not put the Sharia in the constitution? Because I know that more than 10% are in this position. And second, to Heba, you asked that Tunisian feminist movement has supported Ben Ali. No, it's never happened, because the Tunisian feminist movement was in the head of the opposition of Ben Ali. And the famous association of women Democrat is known by its very, very opposite position to Ben Ali. Then it is not true in reality. Thank you.
There's an awful lot here on the plate, so we'll have one more question from the participants and then go. If you're from the audience, would you mind getting up and lining behind the microphone, unless that's too hard?
This is a question predominantly for Anne, which is recognizing that I'm asking you to walk into a real quagmire. I'm inviting you to say, is there any lessons that can be learned from the fact that the information that the issues you're describing of sort of immediate post-revolutionary responses to women and feminism and gender laws happened 15, 20, 30 years ago in Eastern Europe? Are there lessons there that could be applicable to the Arab countries of North Africa?
Well, I was trying to make my list, and it could go on and on.
I think we're going to collect questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then ask.
All right.
I'm sorry. There's a
large
number of questions, but we'll just collect them from those who are standing up, and then we'll stop from the audience. So please ask your question.
I was very grateful to Heba for bringing up the question of a methodological gap in how we look at these revolutions, and I wanted to broaden that comparatively to something I've been struck by, and perhaps participants can comment on this. This is the second one of these kinds of comparative Arab women to other women conferences that I've attended, and I found a similar thing in both of them, which I find striking. The other one was the Path Pathways for Democratic Transition conference headed by UN Women in Cairo last June, which I attended, which was explicitly supposed to be activist, bringing Egyptian women together with visiting women who had participated in now completed transitions, headed by Michelle Bachelet, head of President of Chile, not surprisingly as the head of UN Women. She spoke and immediately kind of admitted that Chile really is not like Egypt and really has very little to do with Egypt, certainly in terms of its socioeconomic background. There were women from Spanish transition, women from Latin American transitions, I believe one woman from Eastern Europe. And especially in that context, and again somewhat here, and I don't mean at all to discount the awesomeness of the presentations, the comparative presentations we've heard, but especially when we know that a major question is the role of Islam and women. Wasn't there the world's largest Islamic country had a successful democratic transition 10 years ago called Indonesia? Mm-hmm. We never hear about that. We don't ask, we don't ask those folks to come to comparative panels and speak about, well, what have Indonesian women done with attempts to bring Sharia back into the law? It's as if these questions don't exist in other very recent and successful transitions. Senegal, as we know, just this last week reaffirmed its status as one of the strongest Muslim democracies, not a particularly new one, but nonetheless, it's not as if these questions have never been addressed before, and I'm just struck.
Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, my question is the way that we're thinking about what are appropriate comparisons also socioeconomically, when we know that so much of the Arab world and voting is driven by kin-based networks, illiteracy, things like this, we don't look at successful African transitions and ask how women in similar socioeconomic conditions have dealt with that. So I'm just curious how panelists think about those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel. My name is Barbara Kumgold. I'm from the Center for Advancing Health in Washington, D.C. My question is for Rima Khalaf. I want to congratulate you, first of all, on being an engine behind the Arab Human Development Report. And I wonder if you could comment how three factors, neoliberal economics and economic inequality first, second, oil politics, and third, use of military power in the Middle East affect women's empowerment and human development as you've outlined it in your report.
The answers to these questions will fill a book. We have now 3 more questions.
Hello, my name is Fariba Parsa. I'm visiting postdoc at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Harvard University. My question is to Dalia. You said a majority of people support Sharia should be source of legislation. Could you please explain what you mean? And when you asked women, how do you know that they had exactly the same understanding of it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. My name is Kirk Beatty. I'm a professor of political science at Simmons College. And if my memory of theory and relating to revolutions is accurate, what's typically seen as a provincialization of the people coming to power after revolutions have occurred over time. If one thinks about most of the classic revolutions, then they have not been followed quickly by democratic elections. I'm wondering, therefore, if what we're seeing in many of these cases isn't the more sudden appearance of a provincialization of the revolution, listening to the earlier panels as well as listening to some of you describe what you've been observing. And my question, I suppose, is primarily for Dalia, but maybe with some input from Heba possibly, in terms of whether you've disaggregated the data to take a look at the differences between urban versus rural constituencies, or inspired by Heba's comment about the feudal areas of Cairo, whether or not you have find enough data that allows you to make comparisons between what you see in certain districts of Cairo or other major cities where that phenomenon is in place versus other places that are more heavily inhabited by people that might be expected to have a more secularist orientation. Thank you.
Thank you. So my question is for Rima, and I'm using the context of Libya, where we saw the international community play a pretty prominent...
Turn the microphone down a little so that you're speaking into it. Thank you.
Where we saw the international community play a pretty predominant role in empowering the NTC and bringing down the regime. And now we're seeing quite a large disparity between the rhetoric and the action in regards to empowering women. My question is, do you think international community and the donor countries should be exerting more influence, or will that be considered an imposition of Western values?
Thank you.
Dean Abdelkader from the University of Massachusetts and also the University of Cairo. Just two comments, one for Ms. Khalaf. When you said that there were no women on the Constitutional Council, the Constitutional Committee, I just want to make everybody aware that there are no lawyers, there are no different parties, there are just two main parties, the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis on this committee. So it's not just an exclusion of women, which doesn't deny that this is an important issue, but at the same time it recognizes that there are a lot of other participants that are not on this committee. My second comment kind of links up with Vicky Langer's comment. Basically, when we look at secularism in the Middle East, it did not bring forth women's rights. And there is plenty of testimony to that, whether we talk about Mubarak, whether we talk about Ben Ali, the Shah. None of the women's rights were progressive at that point either. Okay, and this should always be contextualized and taken, into notice. Whether we talk about the WEFT failing, the feminist union at the beginning of the feminist movement in Egypt, whether we talk about Durraya Shafi and arguing to have the right to vote, et cetera, after the revolution, all of those are testimony that the secularist state did not bring forth women's rights either. So it should be contextualized, and that's why I think we need to go beyond asking the question whether Sharia is inclusive of women's rights at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you all have a lot on your plate to answer those many, many questions, and I think I'll just simply go down the panel and ask Dalia to begin answering the questions that were addressed at her.
Thank you.
Making it as brief as possible because we are trying, but please do try to address the array.
Okay, so the first question was to this idea of unpacking the concept of women's rights, and my understanding of the question is, are there different levels of support for different types of women's rights? The answer is, of course, the answer is yes. So the highest consensus between, even among men and women, is on girls' and boys' right to equal access to education. It's almost unanimous agreement. Both men and women believe that both girls and boys should be able to be educated equally.
In all the countries.
In all of these countries that we've looked at. Where as you might expect, there is a lot more variation. Interestingly, not even between men and women, but between countries, is on the question of female-initiated divorce. And that, for me, was the most fascinating result. Because when you look at where there's the highest support for female-initiated divorce, and I only looked at 6 countries for this specific study that had some kind of political upheaval. So the 6 countries, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. And where there's the highest support for female-initiated divorce is in Egypt, Yemen, and Tunisia. And there, the men and the women are fairly similar, and it's a majority in all of these 3 countries. Where there's low support is in Syria and in Bahrain and also in Libya. What was so interesting about that is how much they varied, whereas other things were much more similar, and how that specifically that question was the only question on women's rights where religiosity, just by measuring, is religion an important part of your daily life? So personal religiosity correlated with higher support for female-initiated divorce, not lower support. And that was the only question where religiosity had any impact. It was shocking on so many levels, but the only other thing that I want to mention is that we also looked at, in Egypt specifically, support for Islamist parties and support for female-initiated divorce. And what we found is that supporters of the Freedom and Justice Party and even a Noor party were very similar to supporters of the Free Egyptian Party, which is the major liberal party, in their support for this right, female-initiated divorce. So the parliamentary activities around banning this right it's not supported by the general public, it's not supported by men even in Egypt, and it's not even supported by the majority of supporters of the Islamists. So where it's coming from and what's kind of pushing it forward, it remains a mystery to me. The thing about, just very quickly, on why did Nahda decide to put forth a declaration that they would have a constitution without Sharia if only 10% wanted that? The answer is, I don't know. They may or may not have done a survey, but I am telling you that our surveys show that 10% of Tunisians say they want Sharia to have no role as a source of legislation. Most Tunisians want it to have a role, but not be the primary source.
Well, thank you. Let me just make a correction. When I said that the Constitutional Committee did not include any women, I meant the original committee that was tasked with to draft amendments to the Constitution, and not the current committee, which is supposed to draft a new Constitution. And I do agree that secularism did not actually bring women's rights. The reason is, particularly in our part of the world, is that secular era was also a despotic era. So when you see that, let's say, the highest number of women in parliament was in Tunisia or in Syria, it's under despotic rule, and really women's participation in that sense was totally meaningless. On the contrary, it triggered a reaction to issues related to women's empowerment. Should the international community play a role? This is a very tricky question. I mean, we have to remember that the international community had leverage and had a say when it comes to their relationship to the former rulers. I mean, they had a sway over Mubarak or Ben Ali or some of the rulers, because they didn't have domestic legitimacy, and most of the legitimacy was derived from the protection of foreign powers. So they could tell them, do something about women's issues. Now, post-revolution, I don't think foreign governments can play a role. It will be interfering in the internal affairs of countries. However, the civil society can play a role because they can highlight abuses, they can bring to the forefront issues that are of concern to women. Also, experiences of other countries are extremely important. Somebody mentioned Bachelet's role, and I mean, in ESCWA, we've brought together leaders of transitions in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Africa and Asia, with leaders of transition in Arab states, and I thought it was an extremely fruitful experience. So it's not pressure, it's exchanging experiences which matter. On the rights of women, well, yes, first, I think we need to talk about rights of equal citizenship. And this includes political rights. I mean, in Arab states, there are first the issues of nationality, the ability to give nationality to your children, the ability to run for all posts, the ability to be treated equally under the law and before the law. They're extremely important. There are a couple of tricky issues in the family laws. Now, women struggled for the right of divorce, and they got it in some of the countries. The remaining very tricky issue relates to inheritance. Personally, I don't think this should be our focus at this stage in time. We need to focus on equal citizenship in all fields. On the impact of military power, I mean, to say disastrous is an understatement. I mean, we can see what happened in Iraq, and Nadia spoke about it in this morning. If we look at the military occupation and the impact on Palestinian women, it has been also disastrous. Palestinian women were among the most educated in the region. Under occupation, people regress, people go back, and they become very protective of their women and of their children. And the immobility, the checkpoints by Israel impede women's ability to gain education. In addition, many studies pointed to the impact of the practices of education on the practices and behavior of men. I mean, when a man is abused by an Israeli soldier in front of his children and in front of his wife, then he internalizes and he takes it out on the family. And so there are lots of diseases and societal ills that result from occupation. Of course, in addition to the fact that any occupation is morally indefensible, but it has an impact on society. Two last points. on Sharia law, I think we should differentiate between two things. One is ruling by Sharia, and the second is drafting laws based on Sharia. The second is, okay, you are inspired by Sharia and drafting the laws, but at least you have very clear laws. The first is extremely dangerous, which is ruling by Sharia and not having laws at all, because you leave it to every judge to decide whatever his interpretation is of Sharia law, and then people are not equal in rights, or because it's left to the interpretation and to the decisions of a judge, and it's extremely dangerous. It's practiced in at least one Arab country. My final comment is on quotas. I believe quotas were important during a period when political life was not developed enough. We had no political parties. And decades of despotism resulted in the fragmentation of our societies along sectarian and ethnic and tribal lines. So if you want to vote, the first person you vote for is probably your tribal chief. The second is your co-religionist, whether it's a Muslim or a Christian. And so there is, if you have one vote, the probability of giving this vote to a woman is negligible. It's almost zero. So women had no chance of ever being elected. That's why quotas were extremely important. But the way I see quotas is they are a temporary measure to address a deficiency in the system. Now, as we go into political life, new parties will emerge. We may still need quotas, but they have to be competitive quotas. Which means, I mean, certain systems where women will run, but then you have a certain percentage that will need to be met, or the Tunisian model, which required the existence of developed political parties because they wanted the system was women running on lists, and they alternated man-woman on lists. In other countries where you don't have parties, you can't even think of lists. So it will take time, and we will need to use quotas for a while until political life is developed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, regarding the opposition of women Democrats in Tunisia, I think it's about how we define women's movement, because if you say women's liberation or feminism, then by the definition that is current, that is used usually, Islamist women are not part of that. They are seen as definitely under the umbrella of the Islamic ideology, and that they are not agents, but they are rather subjects, and you know, the whole patriarchal structure, blah, blah, yani. Okay, so it's more fair, as you say, and I respect what you're saying, to distinguish the different sort of groups of women and to draw a map, to see who is standing next to Ben Ali, because I know, and I wouldn't like to mention names, but I know women's networks who have been saying out loudly in conferences in the UNIFEM and the UNDP and UN that in our meetings, we don't want democracy, democracy will bring Islamists, and we're fine with Ben Ali. And I know that women, other women from basically the leftist background or democratic background, were more concerned about the system and its policies, and I know that Islamist women have been suffering because of the veil, and they have been also subject to a lot of pain because of the fact that their men were imprisoned for long. They were fought in their own, they were not even able to work, and you know the whole drama of the Islamists. So it's more fair, as you mentioned, and I agree with you, to draw a complex map so that we wouldn't generalize. I also have my own understanding of what you mentioned regarding Atatürk and Bourguiba. They had a project, while this was an authoritarian regime without a project when it comes to Ben Ali and Mubarak. But I think that it is a continuation of the creation of this nation-state structure, if we see the social history at large. And I here might go back to some of the work that has been done on the conflictual relation between the Islamic public sphere and the westernized public sphere in urban areas and in the development of different cities in the Arab world. And here, this is useful. It's complex. I understand your point, but I think that it's not as easy as that simply Bourguiba and Atatürk had a project. It was a project that used coercion, that used force, to put things in order as they thought would be best for the modernization process. And this is something that eventually later on people realized they didn't want to acknowledge, or at least they thought that they can have other options as well. Of course, Turkey is still very, very confused about that. I mean, you have an Islamist party that is ruling and that won repeatedly, and that you have the presence and the spirit and the picture of Atatürk everywhere. So, I mean, Turkey is still struggling with that. Vicky, when you mentioned Indonesia, I'm personally more, where is Vicky? Can you raise your hand? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm personally interested in Indonesia, and I was keen when I went to Washington to meet Sri Mulyana Andrawati, the managing director of the World Bank, who comes from Indonesia and who had her own stake in the change that took place. So I admit that in many situations we usually compare Arab women with, if we are too broad, to South African women, as the case, or to Latin American women, sometimes India, but we don't really go into Indonesia, and unless you're talking about family law and karama and women under Sharia, and then you don't then compare to any other places in struggle for law. So I take your point. Regarding urban, rural, and tribal sort of situation of women and their choices and understanding of the role and the change, I think that I would rather, I'm not, of course Dalia is my friend, but I would rather go for qualitative research. You know, surveys don't really show us the different shades and colors. And we have a problem because this is not a culture after so many years of authoritarianism where people can really express themselves. And when they use words, they might be interpreted in completely different ways. So here anthropology is very much important to understand. That's about it. Last question about what I'm doing. Nadia, I'm your friend. And there are very important books that are coming out now on friendship and politics, you know, and politics of friendship and solidarity and stuff like that. Okay, my project is basically a project of citizenship and the project of the republic, not in the American sense. You know, the publicanism in my own definition, not the American republicanism. Okay, so it's like, as I mentioned, it's about democracy and the republic. We have to establish a republic, and people have to know how to argue and debate with each other, and we have to reach a minimum of understanding, which we now are sort of struggling with in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, etc. So this is my project, and my project also is the youth, because I think youth matter. And I'm engaged in different initiatives before and after the revolution with youth. I'm also active on social media because I really want to see how we can reach different people in spaces where people can be classified yet that can bridge classification at the same time. And I've been engaged in sort of training and engaging with political parties and the newcomers into the political scene, especially Salafis. And I think that they are doing well compared to other groups that are not willing to sort of get more insights into what's going on. So regardless of the critique of the Salafi sort of discourse and imagination, in action, they have been willing to sort of get more exposed to different opinions, get training in the university when we have courses regarding political awareness or introducing the political system and how it functions. 70% of the seats are occupied by Salafis, and Salafis even to the very right-wing Salafis. So this is these are newcomers, and I think that there was an obligation to sort of bring them in and train them to the rules of the game. And then working on my work as a political theorist, I'm very much interested in the notion of formlessness and informality, and I've been working on that for 3 years now, and I hope I can do more. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, very fast.
Yes, I think so.
About quotas, I'm going to lean on Mala Hatun's work. She's studied quota making all over the world. There are now over 40 countries in the world that have quotas. And what she's discovered was that quotas are often something that weak governments give because it doesn't cost anything, and yet it's a gesture. And I think that's very interesting, and I think that's definitely something that happened in Eastern Europe, and it maybe is happening to you too, I don't know, but in some ways it's a cheap gift. But I think, interestingly enough, Philip Howard said sometimes these gifts backfire from the government. You know, government thinks this is a completely benign thing, it has no political meaning. You know, anybody can be a woman, you know, you can be a right-winger and you know, who knows what, tremendously socially conservative, etc., and still be a woman there. But I think he pointed out that sometimes these things backfire and that actually people start to use these structures and find ways to use them. So I think that that's what's interesting about quotas, though the radicals in Poland were very, very angry at this, what they considered to be a misdirection of the eye. Away from the terrible economic and social inequalities of women with this pretense. And we didn't, in Poland and some of the other countries too, there is no zipper, which is the big divide, I think, where every other is male, female, male, female, male, female. Then you get actual numbers. But in Poland, even though now there's a 35% quota, they haven't anywhere near reached it because it's hard to get there. And there's no time limit. So, very notional, but still not uninteresting. The second thing is, thanks, Jennifer, for your question about advice that I'm terribly, terribly afraid of giving anybody advice. I stopped that a while ago. However, I do think that as I'm listening to this day, and I'm grateful for your question, that the need to recognize multi-locations, a kind of ecumenical cosmopolitan idea of women's movements is useful in this stage. I mean, there are times when you want to say, the buck stops here. If you're for burning babies, we're not with you. But that's not where we are. Where we are now is this very much what I think people are describing, a sort of groping for the political. When I first went to Eastern Europe and I said to people, oh, you think politics is just about parliament? No, the personal is political. They said, are you crazy? We spent all these years, having the political on top of us. We never had any personal, we never had any privacy. You come from the United States and you say the personal should be political? Go away. And I thought, this is news. This is interesting. I mean, the whole rethinking of public and private, of what is political and what isn't, is going on. And we didn't talk at all about generational change, because older women remember being utterly colonized by communist culture. And younger women are now picking up pieces of left discourse from all kinds of locations, all over Europe and in the United States. They're finding it very interesting to have leftist ideas, and they're not allergic to it the way their mothers were. But they are, and then back to your question, they are sort of disaggregating the inheritance and the piece, what comes to them, and in some sense making their own combinations. Okay.
I know we've got many more comments from the audience, and our panelists are just busting to tell you more, but we do unfortunately have to call this panel to a close. So thank you all very much. And another